All right. Okay, I think that means we're on, everyone. So welcome, everyone, to another wonderful book talk hosted by the Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education, or UMI, as it's affectionately known here at Teachers College. UMI is directed by my friend and colleague, Professor Erica Walker, who helmed this really amazing and impactful institute that's had local and global impact. My name is Lalitha Vasudevan. I'm a professor of technology and education and the Vice Dean for Digital Innovation here at TC. I'm also a proud UMI affiliated faculty member. So it is a particular honor and privilege for me to introduce this panel of authors made up of new and really wonderfully familiar faces. These are all accomplished scholars. They are engaged researchers whose commitment to communities in their research is truly resounding. You can read more about their bios on the flyer for this book talk, but I wanted to provide a bit more context, both about our panelists and this really wonderful book that they're here to discuss. So first, brief bios. Arshad Ali is Associate Professor of Educational Research in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at George Washington University. His research examines the construction of racial identities through exploring questions of democracy, liberalism, and modernity in the lives of youth. Terry McCarty lives and works in the homelands of Gabrielino, Tongva, and respects the sovereignty of the Tongva people in this place. At UCLA, she is Distinguished Professor and G.F. Neller Chair in Education and Anthropology and Faculty in American Indian Studies. Her research centers Indigenous education, language policy, and critical collaborative educational ethnography. Cynthia Benally is an assistant professor of Native American education at the University of Utah. Her research focuses on the ways educational policies and curricula converge with Native communities. She recently guest edited a special issue titled Indigenizing the Curriculum, Putting the Native into Native American Content Instruction Mandates in the Journal of American Indian Education. And Kēhaulani Vaughn is an assistant professor of Pacific Island Education in the Department of Education, Culture, and Society and the Pacific Island Studies Initiative at the University of Utah. Her book manuscript, Trans-Indigeneity, The Politics of California Indian and Native Hawaiian Relations, is about the trans-Indigenous recognitions between Native Hawaiians living in the US and California Indian tribes. On a personal note, I wanted to say a few words about Arshad and Terry, who I've known for several years as colleagues engaged in the American Anthropological Association. Terry, when I was a graduate student, warmly welcomed me into that organization and led by her clarion example of being an anthropologist with communities through her extensive collaboration with Indigenous nations in her studies of language, culture, and schooling. Arshad was a postdoctoral fellow here at Teachers College a number of years ago and shared his passion for creating conditions for the lived experiences of young people's silenced or unheard voices to be given not only an audience, but critical on-ramps to shaping the knowledge produced by research about their lives. I have learned and continue to learn from both of these scholars, and the volume they have put together is certainly, to echo the sentiments of Sammy Aleem's foreword, a necessary book. I came to learn more about the work and perspectives of Cynthia and Kēhaulani in their chapter co-authored with Terry, where they offer this stance on the very conception of youth. They write, building on these approaches, we take the position that youth research cannot be meaningfully undertaken by focusing solely on individuals identified as, quote, youth on the basis of age and participation in Western institutions called schools. Going beyond age and school-driven definitions of who and what constitute youth, we root our analyses instead in the, quote, critical connective tissue between generations. Young people are members of families and communities, meaning that we need to situate research with youth in a more expansive, inclusive, and holistic epistemic and theoretical framework. Research with Indigenous youth is connected to context. Thus, time, space, worldview, and relations with all living entities influence data analysis. This expansive view of youth and the communities through which they move and live is reflected throughout this thoughtfully compiled volume. It's probably important that I note my personal bias here. I have a chapter in this book that's authored with Christine Kerr and Katie Newhouse, and it was and continues to be an honor to be in conversation with the authors, communities, and young people whose work and voices is reflected in the pages of this book. I look forward to hearing from all of our authors here and to the discussion that follows. And now I'm going to turn it over to Arshad.
Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen. Thank you so much, Lalita. Thank you for such a warm and wonderful introduction. And I know on behalf of the four of us and all of the authors, we're honored to be talking about this project and our collective and individual projects at the Edmund Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education, the appropriately recently renamed Edmund Gordon Institute. So to begin, in this virtual format, we're all in different places. So to begin, I think what we'd like to do is acknowledge the places we are and upon whose land we reside. So I'm currently in Los Angeles, and I'm an arrivant in this land. And I recognize this is the historic and traditional home of the Tongva people who have been in Los Angeles since time immemorial. And we'll all kind of go around and introduce ourselves and the places we are.
Yes, and I'm actually in what is known in English as the San Francisco Bay Area, English and Spanish, I should say, but is Ohlone lands. And this is where I'm making my home and doing my work for this academic year. And I'm grateful to be able to work with and for the people of this place.
Kēhau and Cynthia would.
Sure. Aloha mai kako. Hello, everyone. Kēhaulani, and I'm currently on the lands of Niue, Nuche, and Kusiota peoples, otherwise known as Shoshone, Ute, and Goshute peoples.
We wanted to talk a little bit about the picture. And this is, if you can see the background, that's the campus of the University of Utah. When in Western terms, when people acknowledge land or look at or name land, they name the whole structure. And this, in the Shoshone language, Western Shoshone language, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see it? Oh, okay. Right. So one of the word for this area is Moniwani in the Western Shoshone language, and it's named for the canyon that's right there, not necessarily for the mountain range.
And lastly, we wanted to note, since we are giving this talk at Teachers College, and the place it is in New York is the historic land of the Lenape people, and the peoples many of whom were forcibly removed by British settlers in the 1800s. And that's where the university resides. So thank you for that. And so to get into our talk, I think that's an important place to think about, not just, I think moving, in addition to kind of a land acknowledgement, recognizing we're all in different places on this land, and we're coming from different times and places. And so we'll talk, jumping into this conversation about the book. So talking about an edited collection is always a tricky task. And so to introduce this collection of essays, Critical Youth Research and Education, Methodologies of Praxis in Care, we thought it might be illustrated to talk about the inception and then the culmination of the project. And that might be a helpful way to introduce kind of three central themes that I think we want to talk about over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. And those are praxis, care, and relationality or relationships. So I guess this project itself grew out of a simple exchange in an academic conference. Dr. McCarty, he was the discussant on a panel I was presenting at the American Anthropological Association. And in that talk, I presented about some of the tensions I faced in doing work with police surveilled youth. And I was thinking about the ways in which both myself as a researcher and the young people with whom I was working became cognizant that our work together, as well as the research, became an avenue to turn the gaze of the police state upon the youth with whom I was working. The research itself was creating potentially more harm in the lives of young people. And I think this was the crux of the question that I was asking then, and I continue to ask. How can our research, or how does our research potentially hurt communities, families, and young people with whom we work, and not in like an abstract sense, but in a material sense? What happens when we make visible things that young people, communities, and families want to keep among themselves? And so after this panel, Terry and I continue to talk about the tensions we faced in working carefully and meaningfully with communities. And we also talked about the tensions that existed in teaching social research methods to students. As we talked, we shared our own struggles, we shared our challenges, and we recognized like the nuts and bolts of doing careful research. These were things that we learned and we continue to learn over time through our practice, but they're not well documented. And this is something we wanted to be a part of our teaching. And so this tension between our research practice and I think what I think about and what we think about is our research pedagogy is where I want to hone in for the next moment. And I think this was what was foundational to this project. This project grew out of the desire to learn with one another, to share our shortcomings and our struggles, not just as researchers, but as people who are attempting to serve local communities through our scholarly work. And so we come to this project not as experts who have things we need to tell other people, but rather as students and as learners who are learning together and sharing the tensions and the struggles we face in our own work. And this is what's centrally explored by the authors in this volume. And that's one of the reasons I find it so generative. In having a conversation not about what we know, but rather about what we struggle with, and where our practice might continue to develop, we're trying to further our scholarly engagement based upon kind of ethical and meaningful relationships with one another. And this is where I'd like to bring Terry, Dr. McCarty, into this conversation. And maybe I'll pose a question for you. So as a senior scholar, as a leader in the field of education, in the field of anthropology, as someone who has been at the center and continues to be, in many ways, being at the center of the field through your editorships, through all of your scholarly work over the past decades, you're well acquainted with the ways in which dominant forms of scholarship operationalize ideas of objectivity as being distanced from the communities in which one learns and participates. And even thinking about beginning a conversation that way might raise the ire of kind of staunch post-positivist researchers. How do you bring notions of objectivity, notions of reliability in social science research together with the practices of care and relational accountability with the communities with whom you learn? And I guess the second part was, I personally wonder if you've encountered scholars or reviewers who critique the quote objectivity of your own scholarship because of the meaningful relationships you have and continue to develop with communities. And have you managed those tensions?
Thank you, Dr. Ali, if I may call you Arshad, my colleague, my friend. So thanks so much to everyone at the Institute of Urban and Minority Education. I hope I'll be able to more of these book talks. So thank you very much. So that a very thoughtful set of questions. And as I mentioned to you in our email exchange yesterday, I think the questions contain the seeds of yet another important book project. So I'd love to think on those questions further with you and our colleagues here that are viewing this and in the book. So as it happens, I'm currently mulling a response with my co-researchers on a US-wide study of Indigenous language immersion schooling to an external review of a manuscript we submitted entitled Relationality and Relational Accountability in Indigenous Language Education. The manuscript is based on preliminary findings from a Spencer-funded study of Indigenous language immersion ILI schooling, in which Drs. Tiffany Lee, Sheila Nicholas, and Michael Seltzer and I are currently engaged. And in that manuscript, we use Joanne Archibald's notion of story work, similarly to the chapter with Drs. Benally and Vaughn, in which stories constitute research data, but also ways of knowing, that is epistemology, methodology, and ways of teaching or sharing knowledge. So the external review says, in effect, how much the reviewer enjoyed reading the quote vivid vignettes, and it was all very engaging, but the manuscript lacked basic writing standards and felt like reading a news story rather than a journal article. And of course, our intent was just that, to honor and share the stories that had been gifted to us by our participants, our partners in this research project. So to the point, to come to your questions, Arshad, I would say first that notions of research, quote, objectivity, that is what constitutes basic writing standards, are themselves socially and historically constructed and situated. That is, they're very dependent upon the subject position of the authors. Objectivity is itself a subjective construct, in other words. And I think we can and should question the notion that somehow being distant from participants makes for stronger, more robust and credible research findings. And indeed, in our study, we were only able to do this work by building relationships, sometimes over years and decades, and sometimes new relationships with people that did not know us. So months and months of relationship and trust building. In other words, it's not possible to do this work without those close, respectful, reciprocal, and responsible relationship building processes. So in terms of reliability, I think that too is a subjective construct, and it's very much languaged, moreover, in English and other Western European languages. So the language or terminology developed in the context of Western experimental research, particularly psychometric testing, is what was used, what we mean when we talk about reliability. But I don't think that it's an appropriate term for most qualitative research, particularly critical qualitative research. So reliability simply refers to the degree to which a research method is replicable and produces consistent results. In qualitative research, I think a better term is transparency. That is, that we're very transparent about how, why, what we did, so that an informed reader can make an assessment of the merits or the worthiness of those methods. And the method can never be totally replicable, of course, nor can it produce the same results because we're working with human beings in dynamic social settings that are ever changing. But we can be transparent. We can and should be transparent in our methods. And I think that this is obligatory, especially for us where we are both the researcher, but we're the instrument. I don't like that term, but we are the conduit through which others' experiences are documented and represented. So there's always a subjective element to our research, whether qualitative or quantitative, down to the very research questions we deem interesting and worthy to ask. And I just make one final comment, and that is that I also think that research is more than a set of methods. It's also a way of being a researcher, of being an inquirer about our world. That's an axiological or a values position. And I think what we see in this volume are researchers who care about the human relationships at the heart of their work, who are not afraid to center love, care, mutuality in their research, words that may seem oddly out of place in academic writing. Yet of all academic disciplines, surely education is their natural home. So I don't know if that begins to answer those questions, but I think they're ones that we need to think about and need to be at the core of what we do.
Thank you for those comments, Terry. And I think that might be a really nice transition point to talk about the work of relationality and story work, and we can transition. And then I think towards the end, we can come back and do a little bit of an overview of the book. I'd planned on doing it now, but I feel like the transition, where you've kind of pointed to us towards about care and human relationships, seems like this is the ideal time to transition to a conversation about with Cynthia, yourself, and Kēhau about relationality and story work. So why don't we transition now to that conversation?
Okay, great. I had a few words of introduction, but Cynthia and Kēhau, would you like to just go ahead and begin? The title of our chapter is chapter 9, Finding the Connective Tissue in Critical Youth Research, Story Work as Data Analysis.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay if I share something? Picture? Okay. It honestly, not often at Hachini, my deshkini, but she's chained is a planet that should shade what a cheat that should not. Shema Mabel Clashchi, Thomas Benally, and that. Not that deal that they nasha. So the way that I introduce myself is through my ancestors, the clanship. I talked about who my mother's family is, my mother's father's family, my father's mothers, and my father's mothers. And I identified myself through those ancestors. And I talked about my mother, Mabel Kashi, and my late father, Thomas Benally, to situate who I am and the work that I do is rooted from that. So in my research, I think about who am I responsible to? Who am I responsible to support and to protect? The research that I do is the connective tissue to my ancestors, to my Dina people and nation, to my Native students, myself, and to the Didiandana, or the holy people. I came to my research from a very personal reason, from a very personal area. It might have been naive, the way that I entered research, but they were for this girl. Let me show you. So for her. And other Native students like her. So this girl is me. As a little kid, I grew up away from my family, from my homelands and my language. By the time I was considered a youth by Western standards, I had been fully assimilated into Balagana or settler society way of life, and had really taken on the beliefs of settler society. I began my research by trying to figure out how I could help Native students who came into my classroom in the urban area that I taught in. How can I help them to not have the same or similar experiences that I had had? So that's how my research began. I was trying to figure out how do they get a better education than what I received. I found 2 laws in Arizona that require Native history instruction in all existing curricula. And I learned that the former Navajo Nation president and the late Albert Hill was the sponsor of the bill. In our chapter in this book, in this edited book, I tell about how what I was taught from a really young age before I was taken from my family informed the way that I conducted my interview with him. In the ways of knowing, or the knowledge of the knowledge of self in relation to family, the knowledge of self in relation to my community or your community, the knowledge of self in relation to all living things was what I instinctively relied on, despite my training in doing qualitative research from Western frameworks. So when I first met Albert Hill, we introduced ourselves to each other through our clans. It turned out that my first clan, or my second clan, which is my father's first clan, Albert Hill, that was his first clan. So basically he was like my father. And in that way, he acknowledged me. He said that I was his daughter. So we established this relationship of father and child. And because we did so, there were certain responsibilities that were rooted in care that we took on. He introduced me later to his wife, that his long lost daughter had finally come home to hear her daddy's stories. So it was my responsibility to learn from his experience and to teach me to carry on the work that he had started. It was my responsibility to learn from him and him to teach me because of that clanship relationship. Especially now as he has passed on, it is my responsibility to continue the work that he has started and continue to share what he has gifted to me. Relationality is fundamental in Indigenous research, but it shouldn't just be in Indigenous research, it should be in all research. I'm currently teaching a course at the University of Utah called Indigenous Research Methodology. The course has been challenging to many of the students because the University of Utah is a predominantly white institution, and most of my students are white. And so they're coming in from learning about research from Western perspectives, and I'm focusing on what does relationality mean in research? What does it mean to care for the topic that you have chosen and the people that have gifted you with their knowledge? Ultimately, in the research that you are going to do, who are you responsible to? I hear that you have a fantastic opportunity to take a glimpse into a Native perspective soon. Dr. Rachel Talbert will be teaching a course at the Teachers College next spring if you're interested in learning or taking a glimpse into Native curriculum or Native perspective on curriculum. So yeah, so to me, I'm just giving you a little tiny glimpse of the chapter that we wrote together. Thank you.
I would like to add, thank you, Dr. Benally, Dr. Ali, Dr. McCarty for being in company with me and giving me the mana'o to add to my learning. And thank you for the organizers of this panel. So kind of adding to what Dr. Benally was saying, I have done a lot of community work before I became a tenure track professor. So I was heavily engaged in the community through this organization called EPIC, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, which I co-founded, which I also talk about in the chapter. And at the U, I'm currently the faculty advisor for the Pacifica Scholars program. And basically that's a pathway program between the University of Utah and the Pacific Islander community. And I think having these experiences working with community has definitely not only grounded me, but shaped me into the scholar that I am today and continue to be. It allows me to, one, I think, which is very important, be accountable to the research that I produce. And I call that relational accountability. And I think that's great because one, it keeps you humble. If you've ever worked with community and engaged with community, your accolades within the academy don't really mean much in terms of that. And I think Terry talks a lot about that in terms of building that trust that is necessary to do community engaged work reciprocally. But two, it also keeps you engaged in terms of thinking about what research is needed, right? So we're not just producing research for the sake of research. You're actually on the ground, you're engaged, and you're hearing what the community needs. And that's exactly what my piece in this chapter talks about, working with EPIC. The third type of relational accountability that I would like to mention is for us to think expansively in terms of genealogy and mentorship. So who are the people, who are the teachers inside and outside of the academy that have influenced you, that cared for you, that loved you, that have informed who you are today? What type of relational accountability do you have to these people and to your ancestors, right? And to the future generations, right? And so that's very much in line with Indigenous epistemologies, which Dr. Benally has talked about. And these are practices that create these types of web of relationalities that we have amongst each other. And then the last point of relational accountability that I would like to touch on is something that I talk about in the chapter, which is the where, right? So how are we accountable to the places that we live in? How are we accountable to the land and its people, the original caretakers of this land? And so how do we account for this type of accountability in our research, even if we're doing research specifically, in my case, for Pacific Islanders? How do we add that as part of our conversations as a responsibility to our research agendas in the academy? And so the last thing that I would like to kind of leave you all with is when we think about engaging in research, please think and ask yourselves, who are you accountable to? Who are you accountable to expansively? Not only think about your family or the direct communities that you come from, but also, as I mentioned, the genealogies of mentorship, the land and the people of where you're at. Think about the legacies that you would like to leave behind for the next generation, which is very much in line with Indigenous epistemologies, you creating systems and bettering places for the next generation. And we have a lot of privilege of being within these places in academia, that we have the time to do the research and produce research that can better communities, that can empower communities. Research is a very important tool, but it also has the potential of harming, right? So I think being and having relational accountability is necessary to make sure that we are producing research that we had discussed in terms of what the community actually needs, right? And I'll leave you with that. Mahalo nui.
May I just add one little, not so little, but one addition. Speaking of this whole notion of relationality that Drs. Benally and Vaughn have spoken so powerfully to. So the notion of connective tissue, which is the connective tissue of our chapter, comes from Quechua scholar Sandy Grandi. I had the privilege of doing a special issue of the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education with her, and where she talks about she writes about indigenous theories of aging and what she calls indigenous elsewheres. And she just notes that the notion of communities without elders, without the critical connective tissue between generations, is an unimaginable loss. So it was from this that we took inspiration for our chapter to show this interconnection of generations, of people, place, and the implications of that for the work that we do.
Well,
Pass it back to you, Arshad.
Cool. Well, I mean, there's so much there to take up, and I think just to kind of touch on, maybe what I'll try to do is kind of use this as a kind of to transition back to talking about the project as a whole, so people can get a little bit of a sense of what's in the book and what we're trying to do with it, and then I'll do that just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll open it up we'll bring Lalitha back into this conversation. So as Dr. Benally, Dr. Vaughn, and Dr. McCarty were talked through notions of, and kind of not just ideas of, but kind of the practices of relationality. And I want to kind of note that difference, right? It's not that it's not that these are concepts that they're sharing, but they're ways of doing research, and more than doing research, they're ways of being in the world. And I want to kind of bring some of this back to what Terry talked about early in the conversation, in terms of thinking about the ways in which our methods of research are fundamentally based in kind of Western epistemological paradigms. And I think what we've tried to do in this book, and not in a direct way, but in an indirect way, is as we've rethought the practice of research, what we're attempting to do is really rethink what not just what research is, but what the practice is and what research looks like. And so that's what we try to do through this collection. So we have kind of five broad kind of themes that we address. And this first, and generally they kind of talk about this, we're exploring these ideas that research is never designed in a vacuum. Research is always in conversation. And sometimes when it's designed in a vacuum, it's in conversation with institutions of power, right? When we think about the designing of our projects as scholars who sit in our offices or who sit alone, that is still in conversation, but they're not in conversation with the communities with whom we're working. They're in conversation with institutions of power and that's not necessarily how we want to position ourselves. And kind of the second is there are ethical and practical responsibilities of all researchers to local communities. And I think the question that we ask is, how do we manage our positionality, and how do we leverage our institutional affiliation and resources to support communities' desired goals. And that's, I think, how we're taking up these questions of like engaging and honoring communities. I think it, returning to Dr. Benally's, I think, really powerful narrative and kind of your sharing of your own story and your own relationships. The recognition that the communities who we're working with are communities that we're a part of. And then the third point in terms of thinking about data, we're asking like what counts as data and what counts as analysis, what's valuable, and what are ethical and epistemological concerns in constructing and analyzing what we talk about as data sets, but more kind of appropriately, I think, in much of all of our works in telling stories. And then how do we report to larger publics? And I think a central piece of that for many of us and for all of us should be like, what do we keep silent as well? Because one of the things I think I've learned through my work, and I think I've learned even particularly more deeply in conversation of putting this, helping and participating in putting this collection together, is that what we decide not to report is equally important. Because when we do close connected work with local communities, the work is not just to gather the juiciest piece of data, but it's telling stories that are valuable and useful for communities to tell about themselves and to share with the outside world. And some of the things we learn are not to be shared with the outside world, or they have no value to the outside world to know. And then finally, like, how do we refuse the idea of exiting through notions of critical care and to take care of ourselves and the communities we work with? And this is, I think, an issue that for many of us who teach graduate students who are working on dissertations, like, what does that mean to do a dissertation project in a community one is not connected to? Or in one won't be in for very long, even if one has meaningful connections. So those are kind of the themes we try to get at. So in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do through this project is build off the knowledges that we've learned from over the past generations and ask how we can rethink Western conceptions of knowledge and knowledge production in everyday practice in our work with communities. And with that, maybe we can bring Lalitha back into the conversation. And I'd love to ask you, Lalitha, how you think about ideas of relationality and kind of meaningful relationships in the work that you do with young people, as well as with your co-authors and communities.
You know, I've been loving this conversation. I sent a note to Arshad in the middle, and one of the things I was really appreciative of was everyone's perspective in the personal as being intrinsically and intimately connected to not necessarily the professional or the political, but that the personal has many different manifestations. And your question, Arshad, about relationality, I think of a story, as all good ethnographers do. And it's a story of something that happened during a dissertation, my dissertation, just one dissertation. You know, I was walking around a northeastern city with a group of 5 boys, and we were they all identified as African American. I presented as a South Asian American woman, and we would get really interesting comments from people who would see us walking around town. I always had a blue backpack on that was filled with a laptop, a bunch of cameras, audio recorders. And we would just be silly together because these were 11-year-olds, and I was much younger at the time. And we would be in the playground, we would be in McDonald's, we would be in all these spaces. But how people understood a grown-up person who presented as a grown-up with these 5 kids was really interesting to receive as a person who was trying to engage in this research with that all of you have been talking about, this rootedness in who are we together rather than who am I trying to understand you over there. And I remember this one time someone came up to us on the subway. We were going somewhere downtown, and this woman came up to us and said, "Oh, you are so sweet for taking care of these boys." It was a non sequitur. We had no previous interaction. And I was sort of stunned, and I said, and I looked away, and one of the boys said, "She's not taking care of us, we're together." And it was such a moment of kind of ownership and co-relational ways of being that really saturated everything we did, that they understood that we were a unit. And in saying so, I'm really careful not to gloss over the obvious power differentials and dynamics. That to me, that was an important moment of, you have agency, and so how are you going to use it to create conditions that are amplifying of these young people's experiences? So that's just sort of one thing that comes to mind when you ask about relationality. I was, if I could just take a quick query. One of the things that came up in what you all were talking about, and I believe, Dr. Vaughn, you said, I really am curious to know, how do we hear what communities need? And one of the things that I wonder about is what orientation precedes that in order for people to even be open to asking that question? I know it's a far longer answer than what we have, but I wonder if you wanted to just engage with that. Like, what gets a person to the point where they ask, what do communities need? And who am I in this space?
Thank you for asking that question. So I like to talk about my experience working in community, and one of the organizations that I worked with is called the Saturday Tongan Education Program, and it was actually at the Claremont colleges, and it worked with Pacific Islander youth every Saturday with some of the Claremont College students. I'm not Tongan, I'm Kanaka Maoli, I'm Native Hawaiian. However, being one of the few Pacific Islanders broadly in academia and in the space of the Claremont College system, I asked, with such a large Tongan population surrounding campus, how come we don't have a single Tongan student across the 5 Cs, right? And then what privileges, like Dr. Ali was talking about, like what privilege and what resources can we use from these spaces to help co-create programs with and in community. And so I worked with the organization, the program, for a number of years, and established these great relationships with families, and constantly just in conversation with them on a regular basis, like, hey, what are the needs? And then, my students who were taking classes with me at the time, their final project was, you're producing something in order to give back to the community that has taken you in, because a lot of the times these were like first generation college students as well, and they were trying to find their place amongst the Claremont College system, and then they found family, they found community there, and they were taking this course that was exploring the larger historical context of why you do not see Pacific Islanders broadly in higher education, right? So colonialism and history. But I think the final project was like, how do you give back? Right? If you were in community every weekend and you're in conversation with the kids, with the families, what gifts can you use to produce something to give back? And thinking about you being in these spaces as you had a privilege, right? And when I think about genealogies and mentorship, some of the talks that I had with my students before they even set foot with STEP was, you represent me. You're part of my genealogy. So make sure that, you tread carefully, right? This is a space that is sacred for us, because it takes a lot for these families and communities to come to this really predominantly white place that has a lot of wealth. It's unfamiliar to many of us. And so a lot of times, to answer your question, it's, asking and just having these regular conversations and not making it about, I'm the researcher, I'm coming in and I want to extract what you need. But, you know, there's this trust being built, right? And it's in the everyday, regular conversations that you learn about what are the needs of the community. And I worked with the community in that organization for, I don't know how many years. I never published on the topic. And I waited for a very long time until, you know, some of the families came to me and said, hey, we want to tell our stories. And I said, okay, well, let's co-produce this. Let's co-write it together. And so, like, to answer your question just broadly, it's being there, it's being present, and it's asking those it's having those everyday conversations that lead to what are the needs.
I really appreciate that so much. And I'm also really I think the questions that a few people have posed in the Q&A are so resonant with what you're saying, both in terms of the onus of the researcher, but also what are the structures available to support that kind of work in a sustained way to happen. We have one question here about advising young researchers who are trying to engage in this kind of work, but every year, this question says there are fewer tenure lines, and recent attacks on critical theory like CRT may have a chilling effect. Another question relatedly, I'm just kind of posing all of them for us to consider. Another question here is asking about insights into power dynamics when working with young people. You know, as co-constructors and what some other folks have called co-production, how do we actually do that in a way that it creates the opportunities for them to use their voice and agency without overlooking the sort of power we might have to amplify those voices. And another question about university spaces, right? What is the role of the university in doing this kind of work? How to get universities to understand quick and dirty might not be always the right way. So I just wanted to put those on the table and see if any of you wanted to take up any piece of those questions.
Well, maybe I could just say a word about I mean, they're all related to the power dynamics and the power dynamics in universities and working with university IRBs. There's actually a chapter in the book on that topic. And so it'd be great to read that. But I have found in my, in this study that I just briefly mentioned, you know, we negotiated with each partner site according to the local protocols. Sometimes that was sitting in a sharing circle with families and parents. Sometimes it was going through a formal IRB process, tribal IRB process that maybe took a couple years. Sometimes it was an MOU type of thing. And sometimes it's working with a state Department of Education, district office research, you know, people that gatekeepers, I guess you'd say. And my feeling was that there wasn't a lot of knowledgeable support for all those different kinds of processes in the university, as big and broad as the university is in which I work. And I think that's maybe, it's another responsibility that we need to take to help these institutions of power in which and knowledge production in which we participate, to have a better understanding of how all of that works. And it's not just one standardized kind of process that can go through the, you know, a sifter like the IRB. It's a lot more nuanced and complicated. And anyone who works with communities and youth knows that those things, they look different in every place and with different groups of participants. So I'm mindful of time, and I will just make that point that we need more knowledgeable places and resources in our institutions. And I think that's also good for communities.
I want to go off of what Dr. McCarty just said. And my sister Kēhaulani and I have at the University of Utah introduced courses like the Indigenous research methodologies that we both we teach every other year. And then I teach an Indigenous epistemology and education course, which I think helps to give a look into our perspectives, and then just give them non-natives an understanding of our ways of knowledges or our ways of being. And currently I've proposed a graduate certificate here at the University of Utah, and working with Native communities. And it's to do just that. It's a 5-course graduate certificate, interdisciplinary, how non-natives have a better understanding of AIS matters, American Indian Studies, and what the history of American Indian education, how it's impacted Native societies, even till today. And then, so there's 5 courses from different departments in the universities that are, and the university that is participating in this graduate certificate. It's going through the process, and I hope that by the end of the semester it gets approved. But I think that's some ways that higher institutions are able to provide an understanding of Indigenous perspectives.
I guess it's my time now. Everyone, please give a round of applause for the panel, including our fabulous facilitator / moderator, Dr. Vasudevan. I got that right? Good. So to support the book, please feel free to look at the chat. I left a little link there for everyone to please support the book. Go get a good look at the awesome scholarship. And of course, to support the Institute of Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College University. Please click into the support link that I've left in the chat. But also, yes, we'd love to see y'all give some high fives and cheers to our panelists and moderator in the chat. We should totally accept that. And also, you should know we have an event coming up of another Gordon lecture coming up, featuring Dr. Lisa Farrington next month. To find out more and to chime in online for that one as well, as it'll be our first hybrid event of the year. We'd love for you all to sign up for either the support mailing list, or of course you can follow us at UMTC Columbia on Twitter. We've been more recently active as a result of different changes here and there. But anyway, again, please give it up for our panelists, and thank you all for coming.